The broker laughed before she finished speaking. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just enough. Just enough to tell Margaret Hale exactly what he thought. The sound stayed with her for months. Long after the sale. Long after the auction. Long after the entire county stopped talking about it. Because sometimes a person reveals everything in a single laugh. The livestock office smelled like coffee, dust, and paperwork. Margaret sat across from Harold Briggs while he reviewed herd records. At least she thought he was reviewing them. Later she realized he barely looked. His eyes kept returning to one number. The herd size. Nothing else. Not fertility rates. Not feed conversion. Not replacement costs. Not longevity. Just herd size. Finally Harold set the papers down. Then laughed. Margaret folded her arms. What? Harold shook his head. No. Silence. No what? No. Long pause. Then, you want to explain that? Harold leaned back. The sale. Margaret frowned. What about it? You shouldn't make the drive. The room became quiet. Very quiet. Margaret stared. What? Harold smiled politely. The dangerous kind. The kind that wasn't actually polite. Your cattle aren't going to bring what you think. That answer irritated her immediately, because she'd heard versions of it for years. The Hale Ranch sat on rolling Missouri grassland, where cattle operations tended to follow trends. Popular genetics. Popular bloodlines. Popular marketing. Everybody chased the same thing. Margaret didn't. That was the problem. Or the advantage. Depending on who was talking. The ranch originally belonged to Samuel Hale. Her grandfather. A man who cared very little about industry fashion. One summer evening, when Margaret was 14, she followed him through a pasture overlooking the river bottoms. The cattle grazed quietly. The sunset painted the hills gold. Samuel stopped beside a fence. Pointed toward the herd. See anything? Margaret nodded. Cows. Samuel laughed. Yes. Long pause. Good cows. She looked again. Still cows. Nothing special. At least to her. What makes them good? Samuel smiled. Profit. That answer confused her. Because cattle didn't look profitable. They looked like cattle. Samuel pointed toward several cows. Those stayed productive 12 years. Then another group. Those calve every season. Then another. Those stay healthy on grass. Long silence. Then, that's what matters. The lesson stayed. Years later Margaret understood. Many ranchers bred cattle for auction catalogs. Samuel bred cattle for ranches. The difference wasn't always obvious. Until someone studied the numbers. After Samuel passed away, Margaret inherited everything. The ranch. The herd. And decades of breeding records. Thousands of pages. Performance data. Birth weights. Feed efficiency. Calving histories. Everything. Most people would have ignored them. Margaret read every page. And one thing became obvious. The herd consistently outperformed county averages. Not in flashy ways. In profitable ways. The best kind. Years passed. The cattle operation survived droughts better than neighboring ranches. Feed costs stayed manageable. Replacement costs remained lower. Health remained strong. Yet every time sales season arrived, the same conversation returned. Again, and again, and again. Your herd is different. Your herd isn't what buyers want. Your herd doesn't fit the market. Margaret eventually got tired of hearing it. One autumn evening, Emily Hale sat across from her at the kitchen table. Records covered every available surface. Spreadsheets. Breeding summaries. Vaccination reports. Everything. Emily looked around. You're doing it again. Margaret looked up. What? The records. Silence. The records. That means you're thinking. Long pause. Then. Yes. Emily sighed. Dangerous. Very dangerous. What kind of thinking? Margaret pointed toward the herd summaries. Selling. Emily immediately looked nervous. Selling cattle thinking? Margaret nodded. Yes. That never ended simply. The next morning she drove to the co-op and met Harold Briggs. The conversation lasted 10 minutes. Most of them frustrating. Margaret explained herd performance. Retention rates. Feed efficiency. Pasture adaptability. Everything. Harold barely reacted. Instead he kept returning to appearance. Market trends. Auction preferences. Industry expectations. Finally Margaret leaned back. Have you looked at the numbers? Harold smiled patiently. The dangerous kind again. Margaret. Silence. What? I've been doing this 20 years. Long pause. That's not what I asked. The smile faded slightly. Nobody enjoyed that answer. Especially Harold. Your herd isn't going to attract premium buyers. Margaret folded her arms. Why? Because it doesn't fit the market. The sentence followed her all the way home. Because something felt wrong. Very wrong. The herd made money. Real money. Consistent money. Yet somehow everyone focused on whether it fit a trend. The logic never quite connected. 3 months later, drought conditions spread across several neighboring counties. Feed prices climbed. Pastures weakened. Many producers started liquidating cattle. The market became nervous. At the diner, conversations grew pessimistic. Dale Harper shook his head. Bad timing. Rick nodded. Very bad. Another rancher sighed. Might postpone my sale. The mood felt heavy. Then Harold walked in. Immediately people started asking questions. Prices. Forecasts. Buyer activity. Everything. Eventually Harold spotted Margaret. Then laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. Still planning to sell? Silence. Margaret nodded. Yes. Harold shook his head. Don't. The room became quiet. Very quiet. Then. Why? Harold folded his arms. Because your herd isn't worth the drive. Silence. Absolute silence. Several ranchers looked uncomfortable. Even Dale. Margaret stared at him. Long pause. Then. Not worth the drive? Harold nodded. Yes. Why? He smiled. Nobody's paying what you think. The room waited. Margaret waited too. Then Harold delivered the sentence she'd remember forever. You'd save fuel by staying home. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The room simply sat there. Listening. Watching. Waiting. Margaret looked around the diner. Then toward Harold. Then calmly finished her coffee. Set the cup down. And stood. Dale frowned. Where you going? Margaret picked up her hat. Then smiled slightly. The auction. Because 48 hours later, her cattle would enter the largest sale ring in the region. And before the afternoon ended, every person in that diner would wish they'd paid closer attention to the numbers. The auction yard felt different that morning. Not because of the weather. Not because of the crowd. Because Margaret could still hear Harold Briggs' voice in her head. You'd save fuel by staying home. The words followed her all the way through the gates. 40 head. Then 45. Then the final count. Every animal stood quietly in the holding pens. Healthy. Calm. Uniform. The result of decades of careful selection. Margaret walked through them one last time. Checking tags. Watching movement. Watching condition. The same way Samuel always had. Dale Harper found her there. Naturally. He leaned against the fence. Hands buried in his jacket pockets. Long silence. Then. You actually came. Margaret smiled faintly. Yes. Dale looked toward the cattle. Then back. Still think Harold's wrong? Long pause. Then. I think records matter. Dale frowned. What records? Margaret pointed toward the herd. Those records. Because unlike most ranchers, she tracked everything. Birth weights. Pregnancy rates. Feed costs. Veterinary expenses. Longevity. Replacement rates. Every dollar. Every pound. Every year. While other producers argued about market opinions, Margaret studied performance. The sale began shortly after noon. The auctioneer moved quickly. Pen after pen entered the ring. The usual rhythm. The usual noise. The usual uncertainty. Then Margaret's cattle appeared. And something strange happened. The buyers stopped talking. Not completely. Just enough. Because experienced buyers noticed things. Structure. Condition. Disposition. Uniformity. The cattle looked practical. Functional. Built to work. The first bidding paddle rose. Then another. Then another. Margaret folded her arms quietly. The opening pen sold above expectations. Not dramatically. Just above. Dale frowned. The second pen sold higher. The third higher still. People started paying attention. By the fourth group, buyers leaned forward in their seats. Conversations changed. The room felt different. One commercial cattleman from Kansas studied the catalog. Then raised his paddle again. A buyer from Oklahoma responded immediately. Another joined. The auctioneer's voice accelerated. Numbers climbed. The ring became louder. Faster. More competitive. Margaret remained silent. Mostly. But internally, something felt very familiar. Because the buyers weren't purchasing appearances. They were purchasing performance. Exactly what Samuel always said. Halfway through the sale, a rancher approached her. Gray hat. Weathered face. Serious expression. He looked toward the ring. Then toward Margaret. You raised those. She nodded. Yes. Long silence. Then. I can tell. That answer stayed with her. Because it sounded exactly like something Samuel would have said. As the afternoon continued, the bidding became almost aggressive. Several large operators clearly wanted the cattle. Nobody seemed interested in Harold's opinions anymore. Only the animals. Only the numbers. Only the results. By the time the final group entered the ring, the atmosphere had completely changed. Buyers who ignored the early lots now competed aggressively. The auctioneer barely paused between bids. Paddles rose constantly. Voices echoed through the building. The final hammer fell. Then silence. For a moment nobody moved. Margaret walked toward the accounting office. Dale followed. Then several others. Because everyone wanted to see the total. Inside the office, paperwork waited on the desk. The clerk handed it over. Margaret looked down. Then stopped. Read it again. Then once more. Because surely she'd misunderstood. Surely. The final figure sat clearly on the page. $548,000. Silence. Absolute silence. Dale leaned over. Then froze. No. Margaret looked up. Yes. No. Yes. Dale grabbed the sheet. Read it himself. Then again. Then one more time. Because apparently disbelief required confirmation. 548. Margaret nodded. Yes. Long pause. Then. That can't be right. She smiled slightly. Apparently it is. The story spread through the county before sunset. Of course it did. Small towns move information faster than radio stations. By evening people already knew. By morning everybody knew. By lunchtime people started pretending they always believed in the herd. Funny how quickly history changes. The most uncomfortable moment arrived 3 days later. Margaret walked into the co-op. The room immediately fell silent. Not completely. Just enough. Because everyone knew the number. Everyone. Dale sat beside Rick. Several ranchers gathered near the coffee counter. And Harold Briggs stood directly in the middle of the room. Looking uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Finally he cleared his throat. Well. Margaret looked over. Well. Long pause. You had a good sale. The room waited. Because everybody knew that wasn't really what he wanted to say. Margaret nodded politely. Yes. Silence. Then. Margaret surprised me. That was as close to an apology as Harold Briggs had ever come. Margaret considered helping him. Then decided against it. Instead she smiled. Margaret didn't surprise me. The room became very quiet. Because suddenly everyone remembered something. Harold looked uncomfortable again. Meaning what? Margaret set her coffee down. Then looked around the room. At Dale. At Rick. At Harold. At everyone who spent years explaining why her herd didn't fit. Then answered calmly. Meaning I tracked them. Silence. Nobody spoke. So she continued. I knew fertility rates. I knew feed efficiency. I knew replacement costs. I knew longevity. I knew profitability. Long pause. I knew what they were worth. The room stayed silent. Because deep down, everyone understood. Margaret wasn't guessing. Never had been. She wasn't following trends. Wasn't chasing auction fashions. Wasn't buying magazine advertisements. She simply understood her herd better than anyone else, including the broker. Over the following years the ranch became known throughout the region. Not because of one sale. Because of what the sale revealed. Buyers started visiting directly. Performance-focused producers asked questions. Commercial cattlemen wanted genetics. The same herd once dismissed as average became highly sought after. One autumn evening Dale stood beside Margaret overlooking a pasture filled with cattle beneath golden sunset light. The wind moved softly through the grass. The herd grazed quietly below. Dale folded his arms. You know what still bothers me? Margaret smiled slightly. What? He pointed toward the cattle. I laughed. Yes. No, seriously. Long pause. For years. Margaret looked across the pasture. Then toward the horizon. Then back. Lots of people did. Dale nodded. That's the problem. Silence settled over the ranch. The sun slipped lower. Long shadows stretched across the hills. For years people looked at Margaret Hale's herd and saw a problem. Too different. Too practical. Too far from industry fashion. Then the cattle entered the sale ring. And buyers saw something entirely different. Performance. Efficiency. Profitability. The things that actually mattered. The broker looked at her cattle and saw what everyone expected. Margaret looked at them and saw what they consistently did. And in the end, one opinion filled coffee shop conversations. The other brought $548,000 in a single afternoon.